Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and in this video I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the winter canning projects that I have been up to. As you guys know, my rule is that I try not to bring empty canning jars back down to the pantry. If I'm going to bring jars back down to storage, I prefer to fill them up with something, and that is how I keep my pantry stocked throughout the whole winter. I follow that rule until springtime when I start putting my garden into the ground. That's my signal that I need to start letting jars completely empty so that I'll have enough jars available to fill them with whatever we produce from the garden or on the homestead to preserve that growing season. So right now, jars are starting to empty at a pretty rapid rate with 10 people eating from our food stores. Every day we're emptying at least a couple jars and they're accumulating pretty quickly. So why don't I show you some of the ways that we refilled them in the last week. It's about the last 7 to 10 days. And then I'll talk to you about some of the plans that I have to fill jars through the month of December. So here's what I'm talking about when I say that jars are emptying pretty rapidly. All it takes is a couple snacks of maybe applesauce and a few meals of home-cooked soup to where we have this situation on the counter. So why don't I show you the first project that I did to start refilling these jars. I had little Benjamin up here keeping me company while I got to work. Toward the end of the gardening season, I was just really busy with canning projects, and so I started accumulating tomatoes in the freezer, and that is always one of the first projects that I want to tackle when I have quart-sized canning jars that have emptied. And what I'm needing is to make more chili base. We are eating a lot of chili. I also thought I would grab some bags of frozen cranberries and then head down to the cellar to see if any of the tomatoes that I picked green were ripened. And I brought them all up and I filled my roasting pan with as many tomatoes as I could. While those were roasting down, I grabbed a pot and emptied some of those frozen cranberries into it, filled it with water, and we are going to boil down some of these cranberries to make a cranberry jelly. So we're just going to let these simmer on the stove right next to the roaster here that is working on thawing and cooking down these tomatoes. With the rest of the cranberries that I didn't put into the pot to make jelly, I decided to go ahead and do a quick 7-quart batch of cranberry juice. This is a really easy method for making cranberry juice and it fills up jars pretty quickly. So I just fill the bottom of my jars here about a fourth of the way with cranberries. You can fill them as much as you want. The more you put in, the more concentrated it will be. And then we fill it the rest of the way with some warm water, and that helps to thaw those cranberries. You don't want to put cold jars into the canner or your jars will crack. Then we're going to put some lids on top. These are our 4 jars canning lids. You can get 10% off your canning lids if you use the code in this video description. Then we're going to get the rims here on our lids and get these in the water bath canner, and they're going to process just for 15 minutes in the water bath. And when I was done, I just had 7 quarts here of wonderful cranberry juice to enjoy here in the coming month. Meanwhile, the cranberries had been simmering while I was working on that, and I was ready to now strain the cranberries out. We didn't want to cook them for too long. And I'm going to set those cranberries aside, the strained cranberries, and let them cool down, and we're going to process those into something else later. Right now, I just need the juice that has been left behind. And to this big pot of cranberry juice, I'm going to add some sugar, and I'm just going to do it to taste. Cranberries have enough pectin, natural pectin in it, that it should cook down and not need added pectin. We just added a little bit of lemon juice and that sugar and just boiled it down. You can see a lot of that juice boiled down, the liquid evaporated out. And once I got it to a nice jelly-like texture or consistency, then I was able to fill my little half-pint jars with this. If you're uncomfortable with kind of eyeballing textures for jelly, you might want to try using a store-bought pectin to get a jelly consistency. But I've done this enough that I kind of know which consistency I'm looking for to get this to gel. So whenever you're dealing with something sugary and sticky, you want to make sure you wipe the rims of those jars so that you don't have a bad seal. And then once again, we are going to add our lids to the tops of these jars. We're going to get these into the water bath canner also, and these are going to process for 10 minutes in the water bath. Now, I think I've decided that I am no longer going to can jelly in half pints anymore. We're going to move to full pints because we are just moving through these little half pint jars way too quickly. So you can see that they are still kind of jiggly when they come out of the canner, and as they cool, that jelly will set for you. By now, my tomatoes have thawed a little bit, and I'm able to grab the immersion blender and kind of work on blending those together. And we're just going to let them cook a little bit longer while we prepare the rest of our ingredients for our chili base. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut up onions and fill these pint jars most of the way full with onions. I'm doing 1 full onion per jar. Now, in the past, when I've shown you my chili base that I canned, I did it in quart-sized jars. But since I had pint jars empty that needed filled to stay, I'm going to go ahead and use pint jars to do this. And when I go ahead and use this chili base, I'll just add an extra pint of tomato sauce or tomato juice to the pot, and that will compensate for the extra liquid that I normally put into my chili. So these are our homegrown onions. These were Patterson onions that we grew for the first time this year, and I am loving them. They're holding up great in storage, and we still have quite a few left, so that is wonderful. In past years when I've grown onions, sometimes they don't last very long in storage. And something else that I had in storage were these freeze-dried peppers. Since we don't have fresh peppers in the garden this time of year to put into our chili base, I went ahead and grabbed a bag of peppers that we freeze-dried from the garden last year, and we can reuse this mylar that we cut. We'll throw away the oxygen absorber, and I can reuse this mylar bag here and just reseal the top with something else. What we want to do is rehydrate these peppers, so I filled my little bowl here with some water, and I'm going to stir it around and let this sit out for about 5 to 10 minutes while I put other ingredients in the jar and allow those peppers to absorb some of that water before I put them into the canning jar. If I threw them freeze-dried directly into those jars, they would absorb a bunch of the liquid and it might affect my headspace level in the jar. The next thing I'm going to do is start adding my spices. The first thing I'm going to add is cumin, and since this is a concentrated chili base, I'm doing an entire tablespoon of cumin in these little pint jars. And then the next thing we're going to need to do is our chili powder, and I decided to just do about a half a tablespoon of chili powder per jar. I can't make my chili too spicy or some of my little ones won't eat it, so we make it less spicy, and then the older people that like a little spice will add hot sauce to their individual bowls after it is served for them. So you could just add as much as you wanted to taste. After we added the chili powder, I'm going to go ahead and add about a tablespoon of garlic salt per jar. I could chop up garlic and do regular salt if I wanted to, but I'm just trying to save some time and go ahead and use garlic salt instead. At this point, it's not going to affect your canning to add whatever spices you want. It isn't going to make it unsafe if you add some extra seasoning, whatever you like to put in your chili. At this point, my peppers have rehydrated enough that I feel comfortable getting them in the jar. And I'm just doing a big scoop of those into each jar. And you could use fresh peppers, you can use hot peppers. These were Yellow Monster bell peppers that I grew in my garden last year, and this is just a great way to use up some of those that I got in storage. It adds a little bit of that green pepper flavor to our chili. All right, now it's going to be time to add our tomato sauce. I'm going to give it just another hit with that immersion blender to try to blend it up a little bit more. And then we're going to start filling our jars with it. I'm just going to ladle the tomato sauce over the top of everything else that we've put into the jar. You'll find that if those onions are packed really tightly into the jar, you're going to need to get something. I like to use a chopstick and kind of debubble the jar, move those onions around so that you let that tomato sauce fill the entire jar. Otherwise, you're going to end up having headspace issues and the liquid level will be a little lower than you would want if you don't get the air pockets out of the bottom of your jar underneath the onions and other solids that you've packed in there pretty tightly. So I'm obviously not a master canner. I'm not using a recipe for this. How I determine the safe canning time for this is I know that the ingredients inside these jars are very similar to a vegetable soup. And the Ball canning book that I use has many recipes for tomato-based vegetable soups that would contain things like onion and pepper and spices and things. So I know that if those vegetable soups can be safely canned for 55 minutes in my pressure canner, I know that the contents of these jars will also be safe if they are canned for that same amount of time. That's how I came up with my canning times for this recipe. Just going to give a quick wipe to those rims. As always, that's going to make sure that you have nice, good seals on your jars and not waste any of your hard work that you've done here. We're going to go ahead and get our lids and our rings on and once again get these in the pressure canner for 55 minutes. If I were doing quarts, I would do these for 85 minutes and you can do either. This is just a little bit more concentrated of a chili base. After my 55 minutes were up, this is what my jars looked like. We're going to get them on the counter, let them cool, and make sure they sealed well before we get them put away in storage. Now here are those cranberries that we set aside. They have cooled down, and I'm going to spread these on a freeze dryer tray. We're going to go ahead and freeze dry these. Now there isn't a ton of nutrients left in these cranberries because they've been boiled. You know, a lot of the vitamin C has been killed and things, but there's still a lot of really good cranberry flavor in them that are left that I would hate to waste. So I thought if I freeze dried them, I could powder it down and I could add that cranberry powder or even the whole freeze dried cranberries to something like a muffin or a cake or something like that to where we're not relying on it for nutrition. It's just flavor, a treat that we would like to have. And since I had other empty freeze dryer trays, I went ahead and put the rest of the tomato sauce that was in the roaster onto those trays. We're going to freeze dry that into tomato powder to use to make tomato paste once it is dried. So the rest of that is going to go in a pot, and I went ahead and made pasta sauce for dinner out of the rest of that tomato sauce. So into the freeze dryer they go. You want to make sure your stuff is completely cooled. If you have freezer space, you can pre-freeze your trays, but we don't have freezer space for that. So we're just going to get them at room temperature into that freeze dryer, and less than 24 hours later, it was all done. And let me go ahead and show you what this looked like coming out of the freeze dryer. Here we go. Tomato powder is wonderful for thickening up your sauces. We can a lot of tomato juice, and if I want to turn that into a tomato sauce to make something like a pasta sauce, I can just add some of this powder to it and it will thicken it right up. Or if I want to make a pizza sauce, instead of opening a can of tomato paste, I can just rehydrate this a little bit and I have an instant tomato paste. It's really handy. Here's how those cranberries turned out. They look and taste amazing. We're going to go ahead and put them in a jar, and let me show you how I used those the next week. I rehydrated them with orange juice, and we made some orange cranberry muffins for breakfast one day, and it turned out great, just turning those cranberries that would have otherwise been wasted into something else, and it made a great breakfast with some bacon for the children. They loved the flavor of them. And those freeze-dried cranberries rehydrate and taste just like frozen or fresh cranberries would taste in a muffin. Little Miss Hannah here is enjoying hers. And all right, back to all of our canning that we got done. You can see we're beginning to fill a lot of jars here. We're going to go ahead and get this first batch of canning that we got done on this day all labeled up, and the boys are helping me. They're going to bring it down into the cellar. We're going to get this all put away. But afterwards, let me show you how we use that chili base. I very rarely show you in my canning tutorials how I use items like this. So later that week, I wanted to make a quick batch of chili. So I went ahead and I emptied one of those pint jars into the bottom of a pot. I grabbed 1 puck here of my pureed garlic and put that on top. We're going to put a quart of our home canned tomato juice in there. Here is a can of our homegrown beef that our butcher commercially cans for us. Pour all of that beef broth into the pot, and then we're going to put the meat in there. This big hunk of fat here is the tallow that renders as part of the canning process, and there is some good nutrition. Tallow is really high in vitamin D, so we're just going to let that melt down into our chili and add to the flavor of this chili. This is a jar of home canned refried beans. They're pinto beans with bacon, onion, garlic, oregano, cumin, lots of delicious flavors. And I thought that that would pair nicely with this chili that I'm making. Instead of just adding plain beans, go ahead and add some home canned refried beans. And my children really love beans, so I'm going to go ahead and also add a pint of kidney beans as well. And that should be enough for lunch. So that is how I use my chili base. It's all seasoned and everything. All I need to add is a little bit of salt and pepper, but all of the chili seasonings and spices and onion and other flavoring is already there. So what would normally take me longer to chop up all the onion and things like that took me 5 minutes to prepare. I put it on the wood stove since we already had that running to heat the house that day, and it just simmered, and all of those flavors kind of mixed together while we were doing school. And by the time school was done, we had a delicious chili all ready for us for lunch. I have been making chili at least once a week. It's such an easy lunch for the children that I've decided next year I am going to be canning way more chili base for the children. We just serve it with some crunched up corn chips, or sometimes I'll make cornbread or homemade bread or crackers, something like that. So we can't get enough of this, and we were almost out of what I had canned over the summer, so I'm glad that we had another 9 or so pints headed back into storage. All right, here's another canning project we did this week. I grabbed some fresh herbs from the garden, and we had a leftover turkey carcass from Thanksgiving, along with all of the innards that my mom cooked the turkey. She didn't want those. We have frozen celery greens here, onion, garlic, some parsley, some leftover vegetables that were from Thanksgiving, and I just decided to put it all in my roaster and add some water, and I put it on low on about 200 degrees for almost 24 hours. And then this turkey carcass that my mother was just going to throw it in the trash, and I figured I will turn it into some broth, and it will help me fill some jars. So I'm always happy to make broth. We can never have enough in storage. Since broth is a low acid food, we need to get these in the pressure canner, and they are going to process for 25 minutes. And when we're all done, we have wonderful shelf-stable broth that will make a lovely turkey noodle soup or something like that later on this winter. Another fun way to fill jars over the winter is canning dried beans. These were some homegrown beans that we had from our garden. I didn't grow a lot of dried beans. These were just long beans that over matured on the vine, and I went ahead and harvested the seed from. We don't need it for planting, so we'll go ahead and can it up along with some store-bought beans. So what I do first is I add a little bit of homemade apple scrap vinegar to the bottom of each jar. Then I fill each jar 1/3 of the way with dried beans, and then the rest of the way with water. I do this the night before I plan on doing my canning, and I want these beans to soak overnight. Not only does the vinegar in the water break down the phytic acid and make these a lot easier to digest when you eat the beans, Doing this the night before also swells the beans up and shows you exactly how full they will be in the jar once they're thoroughly cooked up. So that's why you only fill them a third of the way. What I do is I dump out all of the beans and rinse them really well, clean out the jars, and then we refill them all the way with the swollen, rehydrated beans. Fill them back up with clean water in the jar, get our lids and our rings on, and then we're ready to process them in the pressure canner. Pints of beans like this are processed for 75 minutes. If you were doing these in quarts, they would need to be processed for 90 minutes. You may be wondering why I bother to can dried beans when it is relatively easy to just cook them, and it's purely for convenience. It's so much easier to have them pre-cooked, and all I have to do is open the jar and dump them into a pot, and it saves me time. So if I invest the time in canning them up all at once, it saves me time in the future when I'm going to prep meals on a really busy day while I'm doing school with the kids. And really, that is the goal for a lot of the canning I do. It is about convenience for me. It is work to do the canning, but if I do that work, it will save me time in the future on days where life just gets a little hectic. And so I'm happy to have all of these jars filled up. But as I mentioned, just as soon as we're filling them, we are emptying them at the same rate to make delicious home cooked meals throughout the winter. So I will have many other canning projects to bring you over the next couple of months that aren't using things coming out of the garden fresh, but are using up things that we may have preserved in the freezer. So a lot of the canning that I do over the winter is taking meat, getting it out of the freezer where it's vulnerable to things like power loss, and getting it shelf stable in jars and pre-cooked and in convenient ready-made meals. So I have lots of plans to make some items, and I will share that with you here in the coming months. But the next thing I need to do is get all of these jars labeled up and brought down to the cellar and organized. And that is the tricky part. At the end of the growing season, I had the entire cellar completely organized by products, like things all put together. But then as we grab jars here and there, little spots empty up. So when I bring things down, it's really hard to keep it organized and not just fill things in here and there. So that has been a challenge lately, but I am working hard to keep up with it, and I'm going to take you downstairs and kind of show you what it looks like right now. What I tried to do is keep like things together. So items that make soups or are ready-made soups in jars kind of go in the same spot, and sweeter items like fruits and things go in one area. I try to keep all of the dried beans together, and so that's what I'm doing, is just looking for space anywhere to try to put like items together. And that's about it for the canning that I plan to do in this video. We had a wonderful week. Besides doing all of these canning projects, we had a wonderful week with Thanksgiving celebrations with both of our families. We were able to celebrate with my family and with Adam's family. We've been doing lots of other fun kitchen projects, harvesting the last little bits from the garden and turning them into delicious meals. And we hope to bring you back next week with another video to show you all of the things we've been up to on the homestead. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful week, friends. We will see you later, and have a great week. Bye.